Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. Last week we had a look through the Tamiya Grand Hauler box and we liked what we found. For those who've not seen one of our builds before, we tend to build fairly close to stock, adding bearings, and if there's any really daft designs we fix them as we go. This being a Tamiya though, there won't be much of that. Before we get going we're going to need some tools, at the very least a couple of Phillips drivers, cutters, pliers and a knife. Some tweezers are going to come in very handy at some point too. Right then, let's go. Step 1, servos. As we go, the manual's broken up into nice sections. Each section has its own metal parts bag. It's a nice way to do it, saves having to dig through a vast amount of little packets looking for that one odd screw. This bag's got a few big bits in it, the rear suspension mounts and fake dampers. They can all go off to the side. The little packets of screws need to get emptied into some plastic pots so we can keep them safe. As we go we need to find all the screws listed down the left hand side. This packet has a small brass ball end and the bigger silver one. The little diagrams are actual size so you can make sure you've got the right bits just by matching them up. In another packet we find the two nuts, one M2 and one M3. Sometimes the packets have a different type of screw in. One for self-tappers, one for machine screws, so it's handy to keep the bags in separate pots. It doesn't always work out, but it does make things a bit easier to find. The servos I've got are Altern or Altern PAAS 700 STDs. They're around £8.50 from a UK shop. They're not particularly powerful or fast, but they really don't need to be on this model. They are ball race though, so they should last quite a while. We don't need any of the fixings or arms that come with the servos. We will be using the ones supplied by Tamiya. If nothing else, to have a giggle at the total system slop we always end up with from Tamiya. In the manual, all the plastic parts have part numbers. All the servo saver parts start with an E, so we need to find a parts tree with an E on the big tab. Each part on the tree has a little tab with a number. So E1, the spring, is easy to find, we just need to clip it free. Gather up all the bits, E11, the arm, E2, the plastic washer. For the boss we need to choose the right one. We can choose E5 or E13. One fits Tamiya servos, the other fits Sanwa. These Alterns have Futaba splines, so we need to use E13. After you've clipped all the plastic bits free from the tree, you'll need to trim off any remaining nubs from where it was attached, and that's where the knife comes in. To fit the servo saver, we'll need a suitable screw. Tamiya gives you a little selection to choose from. The easiest way to figure out which one to use is by matching it up with the one that comes with the servo. In this case, the thinner of the self-tappers will do the job nicely. We need to make sure the servo is actually centered before we fit the servo saver. You can rig up all your radio gear, ESC, battery, make sure all the trims are set to neutral, or just use a servo tester. They all work a bit differently. This one, my own design, sometimes available from 74hc.co.uk. All we need to do is plug in a receiver pack and the servo. Give the knob a twiddle to make sure the servo works, then press the button to lock it in the center position. If you build lots of kits and fiddle with RC radios, even a cheap servo tester can be very handy. One more bit to do. The silver ball end needs to get fitted to the arm with the M3 nut. I'm going to swap the plain nut for a nylock so you don't have to use any thread lock. Since I suspect we're going to be changing the servo saver at some point, it'll just make things a little bit cleaner to take apart. Now the servo saver boss goes on the servo. It's rare an arm will ever fit perfectly straight. It will always be off a degree or so. The trick is to get it as close to straight as you can. Next is the spring. It just pops over the bump on the boss. Then the arm goes on, followed by the plastic washer on the top. Hold it together and install the screw we chose earlier. The washer sits on the boss, leaving a little bit of clearance for the servo saver to work. But it also introduces a little bit of play into the assembly. But it does mean we can do up the screw so it's nicely seated without worrying about binding up the servo saver. Okay, shift servo next, and it's a very similar construction. This time we need E12, the boss, E1, the spring, E6 and 7, which make up the arm, and an E2, another plastic washer. First we need to install the brass ball end with its little M2 nut. Make sure it's done up nice and tight. A tiny amount of thread lock probably wouldn't hurt, but I think we'll get away without on this one. And like the steering, we'll probably end up changing the arm at some point, so no thread lock will make it a little bit cleaner to swap. Right, the servo is connected to the tester and it's locked to center. We can install the boss as per the diagram, getting it as close to 90 degrees as we can. Now for the spring. Then the base of the servo arm. It's a little unusual being two parts. The length is adjustable so you can get just the right amount of travel on the gearbox shifter. Very nice. The only other ones I've come across are the ones included with high-tech servos, and they do come in very handy. To hold it together we need the plastic washer on the top and the longer of the thin self-tapper servo screws. There's a little bit of slop in there, but that's really to be expected, but it will get us up and running. So that's the two servos ready to go. On to step 2, the servo mounts. We'll be needing 4 washer head self-tappers, 2 G1 servo mounts, and the servos. There's not much to go wrong on this one other than getting the servos the wrong way round. But Tamiya's diagrams are fairly clear, so as long as you match up the build, it'll be fine. There's only 2 screws per servo in opposite corners, but I'm sure that'll be perfectly good enough. We don't want to do them up all the way yet, leave them so the mounts can just about move around. We do it that way so when we fit them to the chassis we won't build stresses into the servo lugs. Step 3, cross members. For screws we need 4 8mm self-tappers and 2 M3 plain nuts. And of course we need some cross members, C1 and C2, which end up being part of the rear suspension mounting, and the rearmost member, C3. The 2 nuts pop into some hex-shaped recesses in the lugs on C3. They should be a good friction fit and stay put by themselves. If they're a little bit loose, a little smear of something like Yoo-hoo pour around the edge of the hex before installing will keep the nut from falling out. The other 2 bits fit together. There's some interlocking so they will self-align. All we need to do is install the 4 self-tappers. And here's something you're going to be hearing a lot. They don't need to be done up super tight. Just do them up until you feel them stop. I usually describe it as nice and snug, as in the screw heads are snug to the plastic. Not so tight we ruin the threads, but definitely not loose. Step 4, the frame. This time we'll need the frame rails, and they're helpfully marked L and R to make it easy to pick the right one. We need 4 10mm self-tappers, 2 3mm washers, the rear suspension mounting plates, and 28 8mm self-tappers, but I'll take those out of the pot as we need them. For plastics there's 4 F1 cross members, the 2 we prepped in the last step, and C4, the front cross member. We're going to start with the right hand chassis rail at the back. Make sure you get everything up the right way, check with the diagram as you go. The second cross member is a little bit different. It has a suspension mount on the outside of the rail too. That's where the longer 10mm self-tappers come in. Install all the screws a little bit loose so all the cross members can wobble a bit. We'll nip them up after all the cross members are on. Install all the F1s, the side with the reinforcement goes on the top. Again, leave the screws a little bit loose. Servos next. The first screw has a round hole. The second has a slot to take up any odd size servos, so the screw needs a washer to spread the load. The last cross member is the front one. We only install 1 screw right now, so there's something else that's going to be mounting to it later. And the other rail goes on now. It should fit and line up nicely with all the loose cross members. Install all the screws loosely. Now we can go through all the screws and nip them up. And just like earlier, we want them nice and snug. Start in the middle, tighten up the 2 screws, flip the chassis over and tighten up the other side. Go out to the next cross member and nip them up. Alternate forward and back until all the cross members are tight. We should have a nice straight chassis now with no built-in stress, or at least very little. That just leaves the servo screws. They've got a nice stable platform now, so we won't build any twist into the servos. Very nice. Okay, step 5, bump stops. There's not many bits here. 4 M3x6s, 4 rubber bump stops, 2 S7s and 2 S8s. And we're going to need some thread lock as well. These are pretty neat. The plastic parts have a little rectangular cutout with spikes. When the rubber bump stops in the cutout and it's clamped down to the chassis, everything stays in place. The manual wants us to paint the plastic bits in X18, which is black, but I think I'm going to leave them chrome. I've got a feeling no one's going to be able to see them anyway. So we've installed the bump stops, but we haven't used the thread lock yet. Well, the thing is, plastic doesn't really like the stuff. It turns very brittle with prolonged contact, Not good. But there's a little trick we can use. Where the screws go into the chassis, there's some thread poking through. We can smear some thread lock on the exposed thread, loosen the screws so the thread lock transfers to the chassis, then do it up nice and snug. We get a little bit of the thread lock where we want it, in the threads, but next to none of it will get onto the plastic. Do up all four and we can move on. Step 6. Some front suspension and a couple of brackets. We need 8 M3x6s, 4 12mm self-tappers, the 2 damper mounts, and the leaf spring mounts. From the plastic trees we need the brackets, F10 and F13, and there's a couple of G6 spacers too. The G6 spacers sit on the chassis at the front, followed by the flat leaf mount, then the bent one. Install 2 of the 12mm self-tappers, and we've got a nice little mount ready for a leaf spring. The other side's just the same. The screws want to be nice and snug, making sure the screw goes all the way through the stack. It's easy to miss the plastic spacer, making the mounts not quite sit straight. The damper mounts fit in the 2 tapped holes just behind the servos. The mounts are metal, so we could just thread lock the screws and go for it, but we might as well do the same trick as before, so we leave the screw heads nice and clean. Brackets next. There's a few holes they're going to happily mount to, so we need to carefully match up with the diagram so we don't find we've put them in the wrong holes later. The screws, 2 on the top and 2 on the bottom, will need some thread lock so they don't fall out. Step 7. Fake dampers and linkages. Not surprising, we need the fake damper bodies, all 6 of them, along with the 6 damper shafts. 2 big ball cups, 2 small ball cups, the 2 linkage shafts, and 6 O-rings. Right, linkages first. Grab one of the shafts with some pliers. Parallel jaws are great for this as they really grip. Thread a ball cup on each end. This is the shifter rod, so we use the small ball cups. Do them up until we get a perfect match to the diagram in the manual. The steering rod is the same, only with the big ball caps. When it matches the diagram, we're good to go. The fake dampers are rather nice, much better than the cop-outs most fake dampers are. These are actually nice bits of machined aluminium. Unscrew the top cap to get the body ready. This is where we need the bottom end bits that I forgot. So that's 6 F3s. They're not ball caps, they have a parallel hole, so they're probably going to get fitted with a step screw. Take one of the damper shafts and slide an O-ring over the thread right up to the screw head. Add a little bit of grease, just a smear. We don't need to fill it up, just enough that it's not going to bind on the aluminium. Pop the shaft into the damper body and push it all the way in. Screw it into one of the bottom end bits. It will thread in until there's about 0.5 mm of thread showing. Don't over tighten it as it will strip the plastic quite easily. Refit the top cap. You only need to do it up hand tight. So do that 5 more times and we've got a nice set of fake dampers ready to fit, and the 2 linkages. Step 8. Fitting the front dampers and the shackles. Mostly metal bits on this one. 2 M3x15s, 2 18mm step screws, 2 M3 nylocks, 2 M3 flanged nuts, 2 little mounts for the dampers, and 4 of the metal shackle plates. From the plastic trees, all we need are 2 of the big G2 spacers and 2 G10 plastic washers. Shackles first. Take a step screw and pop it through one of the shackle plates, one of the big spacers, then another shackle plate, then a plastic washer. The assembly then goes into the next hole back from the damper mount. It's not threaded, so we need to use one of the nylock nuts on the back. But we can't use a cross wrench as it's too close to the edge. There's not enough clearance for it to fit. Tamiya though has thought of this and included a little spanner. It's a bit fiddly, but it does the job. Next for the dampers, take one of the step damper mounts and pop it through the top of the damper, followed by one of the 15mm screws, and that lot goes through the damper mount on the chassis with a flanged nut on the back. The flanged nuts aren't nylock, so we're going to need to use a little bit of thread lock to stop them from falling out. And you know the routine by now. A little on the exposed thread and loosen and re-tighten the screws. These ones can be nipped up good and tight as it's all metal. That just leaves the 2 linkages. The one with the small ball end clips on the shifter servo, and the other one clips on the steering servo. The big ball ends might need some help from some pliers as the plastic is quite hard. We can really see the steering slot starting to take shape now, but it just wouldn't be a Tamiya if it had nice tight steering. And that's the end of bag A, so that's your lot for this week. As always, thanks for watching, like if you liked, and subscribe if you want to know when the next bit goes up. Bye guys!